The moving truck pulled away from the curb as Anthony looked up at his new home, still barely believing it was his. At 42 years old, after grinding away for 15 long years as a federal prosecutor, he had finally done it. The two-story brick house with white shutters stood proud against the clear blue sky of the Oak Ridge community, one of the most desirable neighborhoods in town. "Need help with those boxes?" called a man from next door, waving casually. Anthony smiled and shook his head. "Just taking a moment to enjoy the view," he called back. The neighbor nodded understandingly before heading back inside. The spring breeze rustled through the tall oak trees that gave the community its name. Birds chirped from branches overhead as Anthony carried the last few boxes inside. The wooden floors creaked pleasantly beneath his feet, a sound that reminded him this house had history character. Each room he passed through was bigger than his entire old apartment. That night, Anthony sat on his back porch with a cold drink, watching fireflies blink in the growing darkness. The yard stretched out before him, far bigger than he needed, but exactly what he'd always wanted. A place where he could eventually plant a garden, maybe set up a grill for summer cookouts. After years of putting terrible people behind bars, corrupt officials, hate crime perpetrators, civil rights violators, this peaceful spot felt like his reward. Finally, he whispered to himself, "A place where I don't have to think about work." The next morning, Anthony was sorting books onto shelves when the doorbell rang. Outside stood a woman in her early 60s with perfectly styled hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She clutched a wicker basket wrapped in cellophane. "Welcome to Oak Ridge," she said, thrusting the basket forward. "I'm Beverly Keller, president of our Homeowners Association. We're just thrilled to have a new neighbor." Anthony accepted the basket politely. "Thanks, I'm Anthony. Just moved in yesterday." "Well, we pride ourselves on being the most pristine community in the county," Beverly continued, peering past him into the house. "The welcome package includes our application forms. We meet monthly, and our annual dues ensure we keep everything up to standard." Anthony noticed her eyes scanning his living room, taking inventory of his belongings. "The fees might seem steep," she added with a little laugh, "but you get what you pay for, right? And we're very particular about who joins our little family." Something in her tone made Anthony uneasy, but he kept his expression neutral, a skill honed during countless court cases. "Thanks, I'll look everything over once I'm settled," he said, starting to close the door. Beverly's foot shifted slightly forward. "Most new residents join right away. It shows commitment to community values." "I'll definitely consider it," Anthony replied firmly. "But right now, I have about 50 more boxes to unpack." That evening, as Anthony read through the HOA documents, his prosecutor's eye caught several concerning clauses. The rules seemed excessive, regulating everything from grass height to what color residents could paint their mailboxes. The fee structure was complicated, with extra charges for various violations. He noticed the word voluntary appeared only once, buried in paragraph 14 of page 11. Anthony set the papers aside and walked through his new home, touching the walls that were now his. After years of fighting for justice in courtrooms, he hadn't expected to find another battle waiting in his own neighborhood. But something told him Beverly Keller wasn't used to people saying no. "Well," he said to the empty room, "this should be interesting." He had no idea just how right he was. By the end of his first week in Oak Ridge, Anthony noticed a pattern. Every day around 10 a.m., Beverly would find some reason to pass by his house. Sometimes she'd be walking her small white dog. Other times she'd be checking mailboxes or chatting with neighbors. But her eyes always wandered to his property, scanning for anything out of place. "Morning, Anthony." She called one day as he collected his newspaper. "Just wanted to check if you've had a chance to look over the HOA paperwork." Her smile remained fixed in place, like a mask she'd worn so long it had become part of her face. "Still unpacking," Anthony replied, lifting his coffee mug in a friendly gesture. "Got the essentials sorted first." Beverly stepped closer, her perfume strong enough to make his nose twitch. "You know, we're having a neighborhood barbecue this weekend. Perfect chance to meet everyone." Her voice lowered conspiratorially. "Of course, it's technically a members-only event." Around the neighborhood, people called her Clipboard Beverly. For 8 straight years, she'd ruled the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association like her personal kingdom. Before retiring from real estate, she'd sold many of these houses herself and seemed to feel it gave her special ownership over the whole community. "She's been president since dinosaurs roamed the earth," whispered Tom, Anthony's neighbor on the left, one evening over the fence. "Gets re-elected because nobody else wants the headache. Plus, folks are scared of getting on her bad side." By the second week, Beverly's friendly facade began to crack. When Anthony still hadn't returned the application, she left a printed reminder tucked into his door. The day after that, she cornered him while he was mowing his lawn. "You know, Anthony," she said, watching him wipe sweat from his brow, "people move to Oak Ridge because they appreciate our standards. The community pool, the tennis courts, the security patrol, these things cost money." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "It doesn't seem quite fair for some to enjoy the benefits without contributing, don't you think?" Anthony leaned on his mower. "Beverly, I appreciate the community you've built here. I really do. But I've barely had time to hang my pictures. I'd like to settle in before making commitments." This wasn't entirely true. Anthony had actually read through the HOA bylaws carefully. His legal training had spotted several questionable rules that seemed designed to give the board, meaning Beverly, too much power over residents' lives. He'd also heard rumors about how she enforced those rules differently depending on who you were. By the third week, Beverly was showing up almost daily. She'd bring cookies, neighborhood newsletters, or just happened to be passing by with questions about his career. Each visit ended with pointed comments about HOA membership. "Your lawn's looking a bit long today," she remarked one afternoon. "Is it?" Anthony asked, knowing full well it wasn't. "Oh yes. HOA regulations specify grass shouldn't exceed 3 inches. We can recommend some excellent landscapers who understand our standards." After a month of this, Anthony was eating dinner when his doorbell rang. There stood Beverly with a thick folder and a pen. "I thought I'd just help you fill out the paperwork," she said, attempting to step inside without invitation. "Save you the trouble." Anthony blocked the doorway politely but firmly. "Beverly, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I need to be clear. I'm still considering whether joining is right for me. The HOA is voluntary after all." For a moment, something cold and hard flashed in Beverly's eyes. Then she smiled again, but this time it was different, tight and forced. "Of course it's voluntary," she said softly. "Just like being welcomed in this neighborhood is voluntary." As she walked away, Anthony felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. In court, he'd faced down hardened criminals who'd given him that same look, the look of someone who doesn't take no for an answer. 6 weeks after moving in, Anthony returned home from a grueling day in court to find a bright orange notice taped to his front door. "Violated. Trash receptacle visible from street beyond permitted hours." The paper listed a $50 suggested donation to the HOA fund. Anthony crumpled the notice, remembering he had indeed rushed out that morning, leaving his trash can at the curb. But he'd been hurrying to the courthouse for an important case, not exactly a criminal offense. The next day, another notice appeared. "Violated. Unapproved vehicle in driveway overnight." This referred to his colleague's car, who had dropped him home and stayed for dinner. "This is getting ridiculous," Anthony muttered, tearing down the paper. When he stepped outside to get his mail later, he spotted Beverly across the street, pretending to trim her already perfect bushes while watching his house. "Hey there, Anthony," called a friendly voice. His neighbor Tom waved from his driveway, then walked over with a concerned expression. "I see you're getting the Beverly treatment." They walked together toward the community park, speaking in low voices. "Listen," Tom said, glancing around, "you should know what you're dealing with. Beverly's been targeting people who don't fall in line for years. But she's especially tough on, well, people who look like me." Anthony finished quietly. Tom nodded uncomfortably. The Patels moved out after 3 months of constant harassment. The Rodriguez family lasted 6. Beverly claimed it was about property values and neighborhood standards, but we all knew better. "Why doesn't anyone stop her?" Anthony asked. "Most folks just join the HOA and keep their heads down. The ones who don't either move or give in eventually." Tom shrugged. "Nobody wants the hassle." Over the next 2 weeks, the notices multiplied. Anthony's hedges were supposedly half an inch too tall. The basketball hoop he'd installed for weekend relaxation was deemed unsightly recreational equipment. Even the color of his mailbox, which was the same as when he bought the house, suddenly violated some obscure guideline. One evening, Anthony was grilling in his backyard when he heard a strange clicking sound. Peering over his fence, he caught Beverly photographing his property with a small digital camera. "Can I help you with something?" he called out. Beverly jumped, then recovered quickly. "Just documenting continuing violations for our records," she said crisply. "Your grill is an unauthorized outdoor installation." Anthony set down his spatula. "Beverly, this has gone far enough. There's nothing in the property deed that gives the HOA authority over my grill. I've checked." "Perhaps you should have a qualified person review those documents," she replied with a thin smile. "Someone who actually understands property law." "I'm a federal prosecutor," Anthony said evenly. "Reading legal documents is what I do." Something flickered across Beverly's face, surprise, perhaps even a moment of doubt, but it vanished quickly. "Well," she sniffed, "we'll see what the board says about all this." That weekend, Anthony found a group of neighbors waiting to talk to him after he returned from his morning run. "We wanted to warn you," said an older woman named Diane. "Beverly's called an emergency meeting about problem properties. She's been showing people pictures of your house. And saying some pretty ugly things," added another neighbor named Ray. "Nothing direct, you know how she is, but reading between the lines." Anthony wiped sweat from his forehead, feeling a different kind of heat rising inside him. He'd faced down drug lords and corrupt politicians in court. He wouldn't be bullied in his own neighborhood. "When's this meeting?" he asked quietly. "Tuesday night," Diane replied. "Members only, technically, but—" "I'll be there," Anthony said. As his neighbors dispersed, he noticed a paper tucked under his windshield wiper. Another violation notice. This one claimed his car was parked 3 inches too far from the curb. Behind him, Beverly stood in her driveway, arms crossed, watching with a satisfied smile. The battle lines were clearly drawn now. Neither of them knew just how dangerously far it would go. The Oak Ridge Community Center buzzed with whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when Anthony walked in. About 30 residents sat in folding chairs facing a small podium where Beverly stood arranging papers. Her eyes narrowed when she spotted him. "This meeting is for HOA members only," she announced loudly. Anthony smiled politely. "Since you'll be discussing my property, I believe I have the right to be present." A few neighbors nodded in agreement. Tom patted the empty seat beside him, and Anthony sat down, feeling dozens of curious eyes on him. Beverly cleared her throat. "Our first agenda item concerns properties that are failing to maintain community standards." She clicked a button, and a large photo of Anthony's house appeared on the wall screen. "This property has accumulated 17 violations in just 8 weeks, she declared, as if announcing a crime spree. The photo switched to a close-up of Anthony's mailbox. Non-regulation color. Another click showed his basketball hoop. Unauthorized recreational equipment. Click. His hedges. Landscaping violations. Each photo had been carefully taken to make normal features look somehow wrong or offensive. Anthony noticed several neighbors exchanging confused glances. "The owner," Beverly continued, not using Anthony's name even though he sat right there, "has repeatedly ignored notices and refuses to join our association. This kind of defiance threatens everything we've built here." An older man raised his hand. "Those hedges look fine to me, Beverly. What exactly is wrong with them?" "They exceed height restrictions by half an inch, Richard," Beverly snapped. "Rules are rules." "Half an inch?" Someone whispered loudly. A few people chuckled. Anthony raised his hand, but Beverly pretended not to see him, quickly moving to the next slide. A chart showing property values. "Studies show that non-compliance with HOA standards can decrease neighboring property values by up to 15%, she claimed. "Some people may not care about that because they're not planning to stay long-term." She glanced meaningfully at Anthony. "Some people don't understand what makes a quality neighborhood work." "I'd like to respond to that," Anthony said, standing up. Beverly frowned. "We don't have time for—" "Let him speak," called Diane from the back row. "That's only fair." Several others agreed, and Beverly reluctantly stepped aside, her lips pressed into a thin line. Anthony walked to the front, feeling surprisingly calm. In courtrooms, he'd learned that simple truth often cut through elaborate accusations. "I'm Anthony," he said, looking around at his neighbors. "I moved here because I love this community. My yard is maintained. My house is clean. I'm quiet and respectful." He paused. "But I've received 17 violation notices in 8 weeks, while my neighbor Tom has received none in 8 years, despite having the exact same basketball hoop." Murmurs spread across the room. Tom nodded in confirmation. "I've worked as a federal prosecutor for 15 years, Anthony continued. "I've read your HOA bylaws carefully. Membership is voluntary, and many of these supposed violations apply only to members, which are not." Beverly stepped forward. "The spirit of the community is about being good neighbors," Anthony finished, "not about selective enforcement of arbitrary rules." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Then Richard, the older man who'd questioned the hedge violation, spoke up. "My wife and I have lived here 22 years. This HOA was created to maintain the neighborhood, not harass new residents." He looked directly at Beverly. "And certainly not to target people based on anything other than actual violations." Others began to voice similar concerns. Someone mentioned the Patel family who'd moved away. Another brought up the Rodriguez family. A pattern emerged through their stories, and Beverly's face grew increasingly flushed. "This meeting is over," she declared suddenly, gathering her papers. "We haven't voted on anything yet," protested another board member. "I said it's over," Beverly snapped, storming toward the exit. She paused beside Anthony. "You have no idea what you've started," she hissed, just loud enough for him to hear. As people filed out, many stopped to introduce themselves to Anthony, offering support and apologies. For the first time since moving in, he felt like he might actually belong in Oak Ridge. He had no way of knowing that Beverly's humiliation that night would drive her to an act that would shock the entire community. For a week after the meeting, Oak Ridge felt different to Anthony. Neighbors waved when he drove past. Some stopped to chat when he collected his mail. Even people he hadn't met before introduced themselves while he worked in his yard. The tension that had followed him since moving in seemed to have lifted. Beverly, meanwhile, had gone surprisingly quiet. No more violation notices appeared on his door. No more clicking cameras from beyond his fence. She didn't even walk her little white dog past his house anymore. Maybe she finally got the message, Tom suggested one evening as they grilled burgers in Anthony's backyard. "Maybe," Anthony replied, but something didn't feel right. 15 years prosecuting tough cases had taught him that people like Beverly rarely gave up so easily. They just changed tactics. The following Monday, Anthony flew to Washington for a major human trafficking case. The trial stretched on all week, with long days in court and longer nights preparing witnesses. By Friday, he was exhausted but satisfied. The jury had returned a guilty verdict on all counts. His flight home landed after dark. The cab pulled up to his house around 10 p.m., and Anthony paid the driver, eager for nothing more than a hot shower and his own bed. As the cab's taillights disappeared down the street, he noticed an orange glow coming from his driveway. At first, his tired brain thought he'd left some lights on. Then he heard the crackling. His vintage Mustang, the car his father had left him, the one they had restored together during his dad's final summer, was engulfed in flames. No. Anthony dropped his suitcase and ran toward the burning vehicle, the heat pushing him back like an invisible wall. The flames had already consumed most of the interior, dancing across the hood his father had so carefully painted. Neighbors poured from their homes. Someone yelled they'd called 911. Another neighbor brought a garden hose, but it was like trying to fight a forest fire with a water gun. All Anthony could do was watch as the last gift from his father melted and blackened before his eyes. Fire trucks arrived 7 minutes later, but by then, the damage was complete. Firefighters quickly contained the blaze before it could spread to the house or nearby trees. The car, though, was nothing but a charred metal skeleton. "This wasn't an accident," said the fire marshal, a stocky woman with gray-streaked hair who introduced herself as Chief Rivera. She pointed to the concrete beneath the car. "See the poor pattern. Someone used accelerant. And look," she gestured to the bushes at the edge of the driveway. "There's a melted gas can over there." Anthony stood in shocked silence as police officers strung yellow tape around his property. Neighbors gathered at the edges, whispering among themselves. "Sir," a young officer approached, "do you know anyone who might want to do this? Any enemies?" Before Anthony could answer, Tom pushed through the crowd. "Check Beverly Keller's house," he said loudly. This started right after he stood up to her at the HOA meeting. The officer looked skeptical, but another neighbor stepped forward. "I saw her car driving past here around 9 tonight," said Diane. "Thought it was strange, since she lives on the other side of the neighborhood." "That doesn't mean Shay," the officer began. "Wait," interrupted another neighbor, holding up his phone. "I have a security camera on my garage. Let me check the footage." 20 minutes later, several officers were looking at a grainy video showing a figure that matched Beverly's height and build approaching Anthony's driveway shortly before the fire started. The person moved with Beverly's distinctive walk, slightly stiff from a hip replacement she'd mentioned at neighborhood gatherings. By midnight, police were at Beverly's door with questions. By 2 a.m., they had found traces of accelerant matching the fire scene on her shoes in the garage and gasoline residue on a coat hidden in her laundry room. Her car's GPS showed she had driven past Anthony's house 3 times that evening. As dawn broke over Oak Ridge, residents watched in stunned silence as Beverly Keller, 8-year HOA president and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, was led from her perfect house in handcuffs, her face a mask of indignant disbelief. No one in the community could have imagined how quickly a petty neighborhood dispute had turned into something so much darker, or that it was about to become even more complicated. The local news vans arrived before breakfast. By lunchtime, reporters from 3 different channels were doing live stand-ups at the end of Anthony's driveway, with the burned-out shell of his Mustang as their backdrop. "How does it feel to be the victim of a hate crime?" one reporter shouted as Anthony tried to get to his car, his work car, thankfully parked on the street and untouched by the fire. "No comment," he replied, hurrying past. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn with calls from the district attorney's office, from his boss, from colleagues wondering if the rumors were true. Yes, the rumors were true. Beverly Keller, respected real estate agent and longtime HOA president, had been arrested for arson. And yes, Anthony was indeed the federal prosecutor whose car she had burned. Inside the county courthouse, District Attorney Pat Johnson rubbed tired eyes as Anthony sat across from him. "This is a mess," he sighed. "A big, complicated mess." "I can't be involved in the case," Anthony said. "You know that." Pat nodded. "Of course not. Clear conflict of interest. But this isn't just about arson anymore." He slid a folder across the desk. The detective found these emails on Beverly's computer. They had a warrant. Anthony flipped through printed emails Beverly had sent to other HOA board members. His stomach tightened as he read her words. "People like him bring down property values just by moving in. He doesn't understand our community's character. We need to make it clear that Oak Ridge has standards about who belongs here." None of the emails specifically mentioned Anthony's race, but the meaning was clear enough. "We're adding hate crime enhancements to the charges," Pat said quietly. "And the FBI wants to review all HOA actions from the past 10 years for possible civil rights violations." Anthony closed the folder. "This is going to get ugly." "Already is," Pat replied. "Half the neighborhood is calling for Beverly's head on a pike. The other half thinks she's being railroaded." Outside in the hallway, Anthony ran into Beverly's lawyer, a silver-haired man named Greg Phillips, who had defended wealthy clients in the county for decades. "My client maintains her innocence," Greg said stiffly. "This is a simple neighborhood dispute being blown out of proportion." "Tell that to my car," Anthony replied. "A regrettable incident," Greg conceded, "but hardly worth destroying a woman's life over. She's offering to pay for the damages, very generous considering there's no proof she caused them." Anthony stared at him. "You've seen the evidence." "Circumstantial," Greg waved his hand dismissively. "And these hate crime allegations? Absurd. Beverly has friends of all backgrounds. The I have black friends defense." Anthony shook his head. "That's what you're going with?" Greg's friendly mask slipped slightly. "You people always make everything about race." The words hung in the air between them. Greg instantly seemed to realize his mistake, his eyes widening. "You might want to reconsider your strategy," Anthony said quietly before walking away. Over the next few weeks, more evidence emerged. Beverly's internet search history revealed queries about how hot does gasoline burn and how to disable security cameras. Texts showed she had complained to friends about Anthony ruining everything after the HOA meeting. Most damning were recordings from her own home security system. Beverly had forgotten about the camera she'd installed on her garage, the same type she pressured all HOA members to buy. It had captured clear footage of her filling a gas can the night of the fire. The district attorney's office also began interviewing former Oak Ridge residents. The Patells described being fined for cooking odors. The Rodriguez family had faced weekly complaints about excessive vehicles when relatives visited for Sunday dinner. A pattern emerged through a dozen similar stories. 6 weeks after the fire, Beverly's lawyer approached the DA with a plea offer. She would admit to arson and property damage if they dropped the hate crime enhancements. No deal, Pat told Anthony over the phone. We have her dead to rights on everything. That evening, Anthony sat on his porch looking at the empty space where his father's car had once stood. The criminal case seemed straightforward now, but something larger had been revealed. A system of quiet discrimination that had operated in Oak Ridge for years, pushing out families who didn't fit Beverly's vision of the right kind of neighbor. Justice for his car was one thing. Justice for all those families was something else entirely. The courthouse was packed on the day of Beverly's sentencing. Neighbors from Oak Ridge filled the benches, some there to support Beverly despite everything, others there to see justice done. Anthony sat in the back row, wanting to witness the conclusion but not draw attention to himself. The judge, an older woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense expression, reviewed the case details one final time. Beverly stood at the defendant's table, looking smaller somehow in her plain navy dress, her usual perfect hairdo slightly disheveled. Mrs. Keller, the judge began, this court has found you guilty of second-degree arson, property damage, and filing a false police report. These crimes alone are serious, but the evidence shows your actions were motivated by prejudice and retaliation against a neighbor who simply wished to exercise his rights. Beverly stared straight ahead, her face frozen in a mask of dignified suffering. You abuse your position of community trust, the judge continued. You used your authority to harass and intimidate not just Mr. Reynolds, but other families before him. Actions have consequences, Mrs. Keller. I sentence you for 7 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years. A soft gasp rippled through the courtroom. Beverly's shoulders sagged as the bailiff approached to lead her away. As she turned, her eyes met Anthony's for a brief moment. There was no apology there, just a cold emptiness that made him look away first. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters thrust microphones toward Anthony, asking how he felt about the verdict. Justice was served, he said simply. Now it's time to rebuild, not just my car, but my neighborhood. Those words, picked up by local news, became the rallying cry for Oak Ridge in the difficult months that followed. With Beverly gone, the community had to face some uncomfortable truths about what they had allowed to happen under their noses. The first HOA meeting after the trial was packed. Richard, the older man who had questioned Beverly at the previous meeting, had stepped up as interim president. We need to start fresh, he told the crowded room. New bylaws, new leadership, new attitude. Over the next 6 months, the community underwent remarkable changes. A diverse group of residents formed a committee to rewrite the HOA rules, removing the excessive restrictions Beverly had added over the years. They created a system requiring multiple board members to approve any violation notices, ending the era of selective enforcement. Diane, who had spoken up about seeing Beverly's car the night of the fire, organized a neighborhood outreach program, personally inviting former residents who had left under Beverly's reign to community events. Some declined, the wounds still too fresh, but others cautiously returned. The Rodriguez family came back for the summer barbecue. Mr. Rodriguez pulled Anthony aside during the event. What you did wasn't just for yourself, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You stood up when others wouldn't. That matters. As fall turned to winter, Anthony received an unexpected delivery, insurance money for his destroyed car, plus the restitution Beverly had been ordered to pay. It wasn't just about the money. The check represented closure and acknowledgement of the wrong done to him. On a crisp Saturday morning, Anthony invited Tom and several other neighbors to his driveway, where a tarp covered a large object. "I couldn't replace what I lost," Anthony explained, pulling away the tarp to reveal another vintage Mustang, not identical to his father's, but similar. "But I can make new memories." That evening, as neighbors gathered for Oak Ridge's first community movie night in the park, Anthony found himself sitting next to Richard and Diane, watching children play before the film started. "We're thinking of making some changes to the community center," Richard mentioned. "Adding a civil rights display, educating people about housing discrimination. Would you, with your background, would you be willing to help with that?" Anthony looked around at the diverse faces now comfortable together on the lawn, families of all backgrounds sharing food, laughter, conversation. It wasn't perfect. The community still had work to do, tough conversations to have. But it was progress. "I'd be honored," he said, and for the first time since moving to Oak Ridge, Anthony felt he was truly home.